Once again, it is so great to be back with you. I was absolutely thrilled when Reverend TJ invited me back out. I remember when we had a conversation, I had to tell him, hey, I need a moment. This week in my family is a week of many birthdays. My mother, who is worshiping with us, included. It is also the birthday of my godson, my roommate, and obviously it is an auspicious day today. I am so glad to be here with all of you, and I express gratitude and give much aloha to Marie and to Karen, to Jim and to Stuart, to Martina, who welcomed my mother and I so warmly. Your congregation is a blessing, and you bless us with your gifts of hospitality and gratitude. Now, we're going to worship today, and I'm putting out this disclaimer because I think we're going to go over the hour. That is a remnant of something we sometimes recall as white standard time. We are going to worship for as long as we need to worship.
Amen.
Amen. We are going to worship for as long as we need to worship, but I cannot do it without your help, my people. So occasionally throughout this message that we are going to weave together, I am going to say, whose house? And you will respond, our house. Let's try that now. Whose house?
Our house.
Oh, there you go. I see it in the chat pod. It's all right. We will get a little bit faster as we go throughout the message. But I need to see it in the chat pod as well. So if you need to get yourself poised at the keyboard, if you are watching on a different device, it's okay. It's okay. We can share those things that we are doing together, but know that I can see what you are writing off to the side. I have my laptop just off frame. So let's try that one more time. Whose house?
Our house.
There we go. All right. So in whose house?
Our house.
We know that white supremacy kills. And in whose house?
Our house.
We know prophets are people who make our wildest dreams of justice come true. Just last Sunday at our UU annual convention and business meeting General Assembly, we passed an ethical statement and plan for making justice titled Undoing Systemic White Supremacy, a call to prophetic action. This statement of conscience, as we call it in our Unitarian Universalist Association, is bold. This statement of conscience from whose house?
Our house.
Is aggressive. Our statement of conscience on undoing systemic white supremacy is entirely reasonable and allows for us to follow through. It reads in part, seeking universal justice and equity, we call upon the Unitarian Universalist Association and Unitarian Universalist individuals and congregations/groups to actively engage in undoing systemic white supremacy in all of its manifestations. Systemic white supremacy refers to the embedded, institutional, and pervasive nature of racism, white privilege, and racial bias and oppression in our society. We acknowledge the impact of systemic white supremacy is intersectional, meaning it impacts people differently across race, income, class, gender, age, ethnicity, immigration status, sexual orientation, religion, disability, and more. As Unitarian Universalists, we decry the ways in which the intersectional impact of systemic white supremacy divides our human family by privileging some groups over others and thereby generating resistance to the common goal of universal equity and justice. Systemic white supremacy is a direct affront to every one of our principles. That's a lot. But let's summarize it together. In whose house?
Our house.
We have called on each one of us and on all of our communities to undo white supremacy everywhere it shows up. We say the harm of white supremacy is intersectional. It hurts us all differently and can be particularly painful for those of us with multiple experiences of oppression. In whose house?
Our house.
We believe white supremacy is a barrier to every way we have ever thought of building beloved community. The statement of conscience goes on to then offer 4 categories of direct action for undoing systemic white supremacy. It calls on us to engage with the movement in our own communities and nations to heal the evil of racism. It calls on us to carry forward the recommended healing actions conveyed in widening the circle of concern, the title of the report issued by our Commission on Institutional Change just last year. The statement of conscience calls on us to build relationships across boundaries of privilege and oppression. And finally, it calls on us to fulfill our role as spiritual anchor for Black, Indigenous, and people of color Unitarian Universalists. We're going to spend a little bit more time on this particular action for the rest of our service today. But first, let me tell you a story. So recently I termed off our national board of our Unitarian Universalist Association. I served for 6 glorious years, and before that 4 years on our General Assembly Planning Committee. I am grateful and I am tired. It's a great time to be here in Hawaii. As we were saying our goodbyes, 4 of us termed off. Another trustee who had served as many years as I had, and both of our youth trustees who served 2-year terms as opposed to the ability to serve 2 3-year terms. My friend and colleague, the Reverend Patrick McLaughlin, said to the gathered community of the board, you know, one of the things about how we are as Unitarian Universalists is there really is no other space for us. It's like a house where there is no exit. That struck me, not in the least because I had 1 week left to prepare this message. But it struck me because it was true. There is no other faith for me but the Unitarian Universalism that we create together. And for many Black, Indigenous, and POC Unitarians, Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists, there has always never been any other place. Beloveds, Black, Indigenous, and people of color Unitarian Universalists and Unitarian Universalists have always existed. And for some of us Black UUs in particular, Unitarian Universalism is the primary or only faith identity we have ever had. Carrie McDonald, Executive Vice President of our association, Paula Cole-Jones, who serves on our Article 2 Study Commission and I know has done some work here with this congregation around the 8th Principle Project. Late co-moderator of our association, Alandria Williams, the Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed, the Reverend Dr. Rebecca Savage, the Reverend Dr. Kristen L. Harper, who recently published a book through our Skinner House label, and I are some of these notable examples of Black Unitarian Universalists who have always been Black Unitarian Universalists, who have always understood our primary, or only faith identity to be Unitarian Universalism. We never had to choose this faith. It claimed us. It claimed us as young people. It shapes our understanding of what is right and what is wrong, what comes after this life ends. It even shapes our understanding of what is humanly and divinely possible here in this world. But for far too long, we have allowed white supremacy to exist unchecked in our congregations, communities, camps, conference centers, and gatherings. And when this happens, Black, Indigenous, and people of color Unitarian Universalists have to make the unfair decision between accepting mistreatment in order to be in spiritual community with the people who share our understanding of the world, and being without a spiritual home. It is an unfair expectation to have to choose between being mistreated in the only faith community we have ever known, or choosing to be without a spiritual home in order to get free. This is in part why your Black Lives Matter sign is so very important. Each time you put it back up, you say, "In whose house?"
Our house.
You say, "In our house, Black lives, they matter here." And this is the first component of prophetic risk-taking that helps us fulfill our role as a spiritual anchor for Black, Indigenous, and people of color Unitarian Universalists. I'm going to break down what prophetic risk-taking means. Remember, we said that in whose house?
Our house.
Prophets are people who help us bring our wildest aspirations of justice to light. They help us make our dreams for a beloved community more whole come true. When we take risks, when we align ourselves with the people who are most mistreated by the impacts of white supremacy, we are all impacted by white supremacy. But some of us experience the most negative impacts more consistently and more deeply than others. We all have our freedom taken away from us by the impacts of white supremacy. We all have culture, identity, and integrity of our commitment to justice stripped from us by the impacts of white supremacy. And importantly, we know that in whose house?
Our house.
White supremacy rests on a tripod of three different forces. It rests on the erasure of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous legacies, like the peoples of this land. It rests on the devaluing and hurting of all Black lives. And intriguingly enough, it also rests on the willful ignorance of white people about how all of these systems work. A curious system that we created it so well that it functions best when we're not paying attention. In whose house?
Our house.
We know that we need to dream of a pathway forward where there are no exits, where there are no exits from Unitarian Universalism for Black, Indigenous, and people of color Unitarian Universalists. We need to dream of a community that is big enough to hold all of us. Indeed, this is the meaning of the beloved community. Our failure to be in the beloved community right now just means that in whose house?
Our house.
We haven't begun to dream big enough yet. I trust and I believe that we will be able to dream that big dream someday. It may be far beyond our lifetimes, but I want to get free now. We can live with the eventuality that it might be far beyond this life or maybe even the next. But I sure hope that we fight like the hell we don't believe exists in this world to get free right now.
Amen. Amen.
Prophetic risk-taking is a tool of collective liberation. And so I need your help right now. Get ready to type, those of you out in cyberspace land. What are some of the strategies that we have been using to get free together? What are some of the pathways? What are some of the tools that we have used to create a community where no one has to leave in order to be free? I'm going to take folks in the chat pod first before I invite people here in the sanctuary. What are the ways that we are practicing getting free together, beloveds? We're speaking up and speaking out against injustice. We eat together, sometimes distance, but making sure that each of us has enough food is important. If we do not nourish our bodies, we cannot nourish our spirits. Both are necessary for collective liberation. We learn together. We learn together. We spent time inside of this service hearing the voice of this island, hearing the voices of these islands. When we learn one another's stories, we can begin to write and create new stories together. We're decentering the white voice to make room for others. I want to twist and turn that upside down. I am not interested in decentering whiteness. I am interested in focusing on Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. When we use the term decenter whiteness, we talk about whiteness. Let's stop talking about decentering whiteness and actually focus on the outcome we want. When we witness microaggressions or death by 1,000 cuts every day in this Black body, I go out knowing that someone might comment. We go out knowing, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, that we might be mistreated, commented on. For the love of God, someone might ask to touch my hair. Don't ask to touch someone's hair you don't know. And if you do know the person and that person happens to be Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, think again before you ask. We can take an active role, a role of solidarity in building community. Keep it coming in the chat pod. I'm going to shift over here to the sanctuary. What are some of the ways that we have been working together to make sure that we have a community that is big enough that Black, Indigenous, and people of color UUs do not have to exit in order to get free?
Jubilee. Yeah, I was going to say Jubilee and 8 Principle and Banner. Door.
Jubilee work, that training that is coming up again up in September, keeping the banner. You have replaced it so many times. It is the spirit of your willingness to keep replacing it that is actually the message that Black Lives Matter here.
Focus on Black and Indigenous cultures in services on Sunday.
Your very worship centers Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. I would love to see a time when your very worship centers the ways those different communities worship together. Other ways? Oh, I'm seeing in the chat pod that we're willing to engage in uncomfortable conversations about race.
Nice, that's the door.
And that's the work of a door. Yes, I know this to be true of you. I sometimes read your website and I am intrigued by the things that you are doing. We know that none of us has a right to comfort. Being uncomfortable is sometimes the way that we learn. Each of us has a right to protection from abuse, from spiritual violence, from physical violence, from emotional violence, from psychological violence. But none of us is guaranteed a right to comfort. Let's keep going. Prophetic risk-taking is a tool of collective liberation, and you are using many of them. We know that in whose house?
Our house.
White supremacy kills. In whose house?
Our house.
Prophets help us bring our dreams of justice to the front. In whose house?
Our house.
We know that we can work together to end injustice in this lifetime. And we know in whose house?
Our house.
The human and divine tools for getting free together are limitless. Beloveds, let's work to make home in this place. Let's work to make our sanctuary a house with no exits for the beloved community. Beloveds, it is time for us to get free together. And let the people say, Amen.
Amen.
Ashe.
Ashe.
And blessed be.
Blessed be.
Let us lift our voices in song.